exactly.
All right, well, welcome everybody. It's season number 4, episode number 3 of the Global Radio Ideas webinar series. Good to see everybody again. My name is Ken Benson from P1 Media Group, and from LA, pinch hitting for Andy Sandeman today, the president of Benztown. Dave Dennis, also better known as Chachi, which we'll stick with today, his radio name. So Chachi, roll, baby.
All right. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm going to be filling in for Andy, who's unfortunately under the weather. Today's webinar is how do you replace Scott Shannon and lessons from an iconic New York City program director. And when I say iconic, I think he's just iconic around the world. He is known more around the world than I think even Jump Around is. The chat box is activated. Please let us know if you're watching. And if you have a question, please post it. Our guest is going to be answering questions at the end of today's webinar. So please feel free to ask away.
So we're going to do the condensed introduction for our guest today. He cut his teeth in CHR radio, working as an air talent in markets like Denver, Pittsburgh, Miami, Detroit, before landing his first programming job overseeing stations in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Florida. We met in the early 90s. We were both in Portland, Oregon. It's funny, that's what I said before I moved here. Oregon, where I was programming CHR Z100, and our guest was the PD and morning man at a crosstown hot AC rival, Q105, which was co-owned at the time with one of the world's biggest rock bands, which we'll hear more about. He went on to Philadelphia and played an instrumental role in establishing the iconic AC WBEB, and I worked at a WBAB, so again, sorry for the slip, which was a perennial market leader under Jim's leadership. In 96, he became the VP of AC programming for another iconic station, 106.7 Light FM in New York City. And during his 12 years there, I think he was number one. It was probably every quarter, right? Right there, Jim?
No, well, adults 25-54. No, it was 35 out of 42 rating books, but we were never lower than second. So
close enough, and always one of the top billers in America. Before joining CBS Radio in New York, he formed his own consulting companies, leading AC stations across America. And during his career, he advised talents such as Delilah and Casey Kasem and Scott Shannon and Broadway Bill Lee, who's here today. And today he serves as Senior VP of Programming for Odyssey in New York, overseeing NEW, the 102.7, and the iconic WCBS-FM in New York. Please welcome, via Florida, but sometimes in New York, Jim Ryan.
Just got back from New York. We had label meetings yesterday and day before, and very interesting dialogue on the future of radio. So good stuff.
So, Jim, before we jump in on how you replaced Scott and you teach us some of the incredible lessons you've learned over the years, let's begin by telling us something about yourself that we don't know.
Well, Ken mentioned Portland, and I think this is not only is it something that I don't think everyone knows, but I think it was a really good life lesson. I went out to Portland to program a radio station. We moved it from Salem to Portland, putting a tower on a mountain halfway between the two cities. And we were owned by a gentleman who had highly invested in Northeast real estate. And we were a Rock 40 station. We got as high as a 10 share in 1989, playing, banging on stuff like Guns N' Roses and Scorpions and those kinds of bands. And I developed lots of friendships with bands and band managers. And then about 1990, there was the very beginning of hot AC radio, and it really looked like a place that made sense to go because our demographics as a loud screaming radio station, we didn't have much above the age of 24. And we wanted to be much more sellable. Plus, in fact, my wife was general manager. My wife-to-be, I guess, was general manager. So we went into hot AC. One of my mentors was Steve Berger, who was president of Nationwide Communications, and he said, "Do you know Guy Zapolian?" And I said I didn't. And he said, well, I'm going to call Guy, and you get on a plane, you go to Houston, and you spend a day with Guy Zapolian, and he's going to tell you how hot AC works. So I did that, and God bless Guy for spending the time with me and showing me everything that he knew. And I went back to Portland, and we flipped to the hot AC format. Shortly thereafter, the company went into bankruptcy. So you know what happens when you change formats of a radio station and you have no money to tell anybody. The ratings go down before they go up. Sadly, this occurred at the same time the parent company went into bankruptcy. The most important day of my life, I think, was when we were showing the radio station to people who were going to buy it from Bank of Boston. And when I asked this gentleman from Kansas what he was going to do with the radio station if he was able to secure it, was he said the first thing he was going to do was fire me because I was obviously an incompetent programmer because the station had no ratings. So I called my godfather in music, Ed Leffler, who's manager of the band Van Halen. His career was quite incredible. He was road manager for the Beatles, involved with the Osmonds, co-manager of the Carpenters, and he managed Sammy Hagar. And when David Lee Roth left the band, he became manager of Van Halen. And I said, Ed, do you have any money? And Ed
amazing.
said, well, Van Halen is doing the Monsters of Rock tour right now, and we're doing about $250,000 every night. And I said, you want to buy a radio station? And he said, only if you are a partner with us. So I went from the lowest day of my life to maxing out all my credit cards, borrowing $27,000 from my future father-in-law, and we bought a radio station. Ed sadly passed away. Sammy was going through a divorce, and we ended up selling the radio station, but we sold it for 6 times what we paid for it. My wife and I got a management bonus in addition to the profit that we made, and it sort of changed my life. So I think the life lesson out of this to anyone, when you're unemployed, when you think things are absolutely at the lowest level, you can change your life for the good, because that's what propelled me on to Philadelphia to work for Jerry Lee, which was like going through graduate school, and then on to the #1 market and the incredible time that I've had in New York since 1996.
What a remarkable story. And I got so many questions, but we'll save it later for the podcast because I don't want to hold this up. But thank you so much for sharing.
So Jim, let's get right to it. Scott Shannon, what was it like working with Scott, and what was it like being Scott's boss?
Well, I met Scott in 1989 when I was in Portland. As a matter of fact, that's the picture there. We were at the Rolling Stones Steel Wheels tour. Guns N' Roses opened for the Stones at the LA Coliseum. Scott was running pirate radio at the time, and Scott walked into the room, and I found myself wanting to talk to him far more than Mick Jagger, because I was a radio geek, and Scott was the ultimate gentleman. He was I'll give you an example. Here he is, programming in Los Angeles, having just had the huge success story in New York with Z100. And the next morning we were flying out of LAX, and he was dropping his wife off at the airport and saw us in the security line and came over and said it was great meeting you last night, and have a safe trip back, and let's stay in touch. And anytime I would go to Arbitron throughout the years when I was in Portland to look at diaries, I would always go through New York because my family was on Long Island, and I would always go up to see Scott at WPLJ. I mean, he would always ask me when we were programming the radio, say, send me a music log. I'll give you some advice on it. So he was always a mentor to me throughout all those years. And in 2012, when I took over CBS-FM, I pulled a song list from the year-end 2011 of CBS-FM. Our most played song was Sly and the Family Stone, People, Four Tops, Reach Out, I'll Be There, Aretha, Respect. Only 2 of the songs of the top 20 most played were from even the 70s. Yes, we played 80s songs. Yes, we played 70s songs, but it was we did Motown Mondays. It was a very old radio station, and we really needed to contemporize it and get into the 80s. The 80s was the passionate decade that we absolutely needed to move into. So in 2014, when Scott became available, when he decided to leave WPLJ, it was so exciting to bring him on board. He was the multimedia advertising campaign that we could not afford, because he introduced New York to Z100, being the ringmaster of the Z Morning Zoo. He introduced New York to every major 80s artist, starting with Madonna. I mean, she used to hang out in the lobby at Z100 wanting a shot. So he changed the whole image of the radio station. You know, we talked about Broadway Bill. I mean, Broadway Bill's rating shot up immediately when Scott became a part of the staff, simply because there were so many people that were sampling the radio station that it was not acceptable to listen to before. And what's it like having someone who's, you know, a friend, a mentor, and suddenly he allegedly reports to you? It's a tough situation, but you know, I think I always let Scott handle the morning show as Scott wanted to handle the morning show. I mean, Scott, when Scott wanted Patty Steele to be the news person on the show, we got Patty Steele. When he wanted to change weather people from Mr. G to John Elliott, we did that because when he wanted to name the assistant producer Trevor, when he wanted to change his name to Kermit the Wonder Frog, we let Scott do it. How do you not let someone who had that kind of experience making legendary morning shows from Washington to Tampa to New York to Los Angeles, you know, make those changes? I mean, I think I was more of a musicologist than I was a morning show coach, morning show organizer. So, you know, I let Scott play to his strengths and let him handle that. And you know, we had unparalleled success for a long time with Scott and the morning show on CBS-FM. We had some #1 rating books, and you know, I mean, it was great to sit at my desk with Scott across and say, how about this? You know, you had #1 rating books at Z100, now a #1 rating book here at CBS-FM. I had many #1 rating books at Light FM's WLTW, and now we're #1 on CBS-FM. Not many people get a chance to be a part of 2 #1 radio stations in New York. Broadway Bill was part of it as well. I mean, Broadway was part of a #1 rated KTU and #1 CBS-FM. I mean, it's pretty thrilling to do it once. It's pretty incredibly lucky to be blessed to be able to do it twice.
And I think there's only a handful of people that have ever accomplished that. We were talking about that yesterday. It's just an incredible accomplishment. Jim, you wake up one day with like the nearly impossible task of replacing Scott. I mean, what was that like? What's going through your head, and how do you ultimately replace the greatest all-time New York morning radio show host? Maybe, I mean, Scott or Howard are probably the two biggest.
Well, you know, COVID changed everything. I mean, it just did. It changed. And there's not one person in this business that hasn't felt the pain of COVID. And you know, one of the things Scott and his show was he was bigger than life. He did bigger than life events. You know, it was much easier for him to do bigger than life events when you're at a radio station that plays currents, and every act wants to be a part of your show. Well, in classic hits, it was a little harder. We had to write checks. So when we wanted Taylor Dayne to be a part of the Summer Blast Off, or Bret Michaels, or whoever, we had to write checks. And Scott was a ringmaster. I mean, Scott surrounded himself with people, so he knew who to go to for any given subject. And one by one, those cast members, because of the economic effects of COVID, disappeared. I mean, the weather guy, John Elliott, he was the funny guy on the show. And Scott knew when to go to him for a punchline, and suddenly he wasn't there, and suddenly Kermit the Wonder Frog wasn't there, and suddenly we weren't able to do bigger than life events. So a lot of the luster, and I think a lot of the fun of doing the show for Scott, disappeared, and Scott left, and I knew we couldn't recreate what Scott did. My midday personality, Race Taylor, applied for the job, and I love Race. And the two thoughts that went through my head were, okay, Race always, for many years, filled in for Scott and Todd when they were on vacation. If Race does mornings, are they going to expect that he's just filling in for Scott? And the other thing is that Race had the strongest day part on the radio station and owned middays. So really, do you want to take a shot at Race in mornings and screw up middays and screw up 2 day parts? So there was this guy who had programmed New York country, and he was a part of our country programming team, who I always remembered from afternoons on PLJ. He could play a lot of music. He could be quirky. He could be funny. He programmed country music. Country music is the same values essentially as classic hits. I mean, you want to have community ties. You want to have strong involvement. You want to have touch your listeners as much as you can. And I just found John Fox to be funny in the hallway and quirky. It was kind of a little tug of war with Jeff Sotolano, who is our EVP of programming, because Jeff really wanted John running country music radio stations around the country. Chris Oliveira, my partner in crime in New York, and who I've been blessed to work with for a long time from his days at CBS, he and I had kind of a little tug of war with Jeff, trying to get John to become program director, or brand manager of CBS-FM, and do the morning show. And my logistics were that John was going to do a totally different show than Scott. And I think that's where we needed to go, because anything that we tried to create, Scott did, would only be compared to Scott. So let's go in a totally different direction. So we convinced John to do it. And I, quite frankly, didn't know if the decision would go that way, but I was very happy when John made it. And Chris and I let John pick his partner, because one of the things that I've discovered over the years in putting together morning shows is shotgun marriages never work. Okay, this is your new partner. Chances are it's not going to work. So John dated. John went through January meeting people, having lunch with them, trying to decide who that partner would be. Who is the perfect date? Who is he going to marry on the radio? We played, Scott left on December 16th. It was his last show. He did a heartfelt goodbye from Blythedale Hospital, where he had broadcast his last show of the year, all throughout his time at PLJ and through CBS-FM. helping the kids there. Rob Thomas, always a part of that broadcast, so he's fabulous. So we played music. We played a lot of music. Jesse Addy, is one of our part-time people, filled in, played a lot of music. We minimalized content on the air. 7 weeks of music. So it was kind of a palate cleanser. And Scott and Annie debuted in early February. And so far, the results are freaking amazing. There it is. I mean, right now, the latest April monthly with adults 25-54 that just came back on Monday, we are 1 share point behind market leading Elvis Duran with a 6-1 share to Elvis's 7-1 with adults 25-54. I mean, this is an incredible success, but I think you always have to look at branding when you're, no matter what. I mean, one of the reasons I think Scott wanted to move on and we wanted to make this was Scott wasn't fulfilling his brand because he was the ringmaster. He always had a large cast. Suddenly, he didn't have that cast. I mean, I did a morning show with Whoopi Goldberg for a while at Premiere. We syndicated it. We debuted the show in 06. And you would sit in the studio and people would call in and say, Whoopi, you're hysterical. You're so funny. Sister Act was my absolute favorite movie of all time. And Whoopi was like, I don't want to do Sister Act. She wanted to be the Whoopi Goldberg that's on The View today. And that's not what the audience expectation was. That's not what her brand was at the time. So Whoopi didn't really work. It takes a lot to change a brand. Whoopi has since, with her time on The View, changed her brand. And the days of big morning shows that aren't on multiple radio stations, I mean, obviously Elvis Duran is on in Miami and Philadelphia, and certainly iHeart can carry his staff of 12, 15, however many people are there. But in a local market these days, you can't do that anymore. You just you see how many shows are voice tracked around the country, and what we've got to do, it's return on investment. So in lieu of creating a big morning show, we went in a wholly different direction with John and Annie, and they're doing great features. I mean, they do a little thing around town. They spotlight a business once a week. They're playing games with the listeners, and they're playing a lot of music. And it's a great show, and they've made a connection already in New York with their audience.
Wow, fantastic! And congrats on the early results. It's incredible, because I think everybody listening would have been having a heart attack with Scott Shannon retiring, saying, what do we do? And how is that going to work?
There were a lot of sleepless nights. I'm not going to lie to you. And I will say I interviewed a lot of great shows. There's a lot of talent out there, and it sort of reaffirmed my belief in the strength of personality radio. And look, that's the thing that we have to look at right now. I mean, as you look at research studies, I mean, Ken, you know this better than anyone, how Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, we've all got music. They all play less commercials than we do in commercial radio. So we really need to stand out by what we do between the songs. We really need great people. We really need people to tell their story on the radio. Look, I'm very lucky that right now in New York, I'm working with 2 shows that are top 5 in adults 25-54. Wow. The NEW show with Karen Carson in the morning is done extremely well, and it's they talk about their lives. I mean, this morning Karen talked about how her daughter was going to be on the court at the prom tonight, and one of the people on the morning show said, well, you know, if she's on the court, how does she get to be queen? So they called Buckingham Palace. Why not? You know, it's how you expand upon the breaks, how you, as Steve Reynolds would say, you pivot. What can you add to a break to make it even better? And I think a lot of talent are starting to think that way, and you know, you're going to save our business, so keep doing it.
You know what's remarkable is that 3 out of the top 5 morning shows in New York you've had something to do with, because you helped create at least half of the LTW morning show. I know they obviously changed.
Well, I hired Christine Nagy, and Cubby was Whoopi's partner. So
that's right.
You know,
that's
I worked
right.
with
that's crazy.
Both of them.
So Jim,
Sorry,
you know, as we heard, obviously you worked with Scott Shannon, Whoopi Goldberg, Delilah, had some influence on Casey Kasem. You work with Radio Hall of Famer Broadway Bill Lee at CBS-FM. We generally have a lot of programmers join these videos and webinars. So what are some of the lessons you learned from coaching heavyweight talent over the years that would help these guys with their stations? Because as you know, I think a lot of programmers have difficulty connecting with the talent in a constructive and positive way. So what can you share with all your years of wisdom?
You know, I think you have to treat everyone totally different. I mean, there's no one way to critique a talent. I mean, I would, with Scott, I mean, I talked about how, you know, it was his show and I let him do his show as he needed to do it. But, you know, if there was a day that he went off the rails, you know, you just make a note of it. And you bring it up at the appropriate time. You need to let them know that you're paying attention. And, you know, even the greatest talent in the world sometimes strays and, you know, goes one subject too far or crosses the line. You know, and then there's, you try to listen to a break or a, you know, content segment, and how could you have enriched that? How could you make it better? You know, and there's people like Broadway Bill Lee who, you know, I you know, you can't say much to Broadway other than I think you may have crossed the line on that one. You know, and that's all you got to say to Bill. He goes, yeah, I know. Okay, it won't happen again, and it doesn't.
Perfect.
But you know, working with talent at the level that I get to is very different than, you know, the days in Portland when you know, you really need to go to, you know, weekly air check sessions and sit down and listen to an hour of a show. I mean, I've never done an air check session with Broadway Bill. I couldn't imagine ever doing an air check session with Scott Shannon. You know, Scott and Broadway remember every break they've ever done. So it's, you know, it's very easy giving direction to people like that.
Hey, Ken, to make sure we're staying on time, we have time for Q&As because I know we're going to have a lot of questions for Jim. I'm going to skip over the pre-COVID, post-COVID because Jim pretty much already hit on that. Is that okay Perfect. With you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So we will take some questions at the end of the show from Jim. So if you have something, feel free to type it in the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the program. So Jim, when we were chatting last week about having you on, you talked about how important it is to be bold when making changes at a radio station. So why is it better to be bold than subtle? And maybe share a few examples of what you mean by that.
Well, I think that from working with formats and program directors around the country, you could say to a programmer, you know, that the station sounds a little too old or too new or something, and they change one position on the format clock and go, okay, it's fixed. Well, that's something that nobody notices. I mean, your average listener, when you know, 20-minute occasion, 10-minute occasion, whatever, you're between your P1s, your average listener, the occasions are short and listeners just don't notice. So you really need to bang them over the head when you make a change. If you need to make a major change, you really have to let them know you made a major change. Um, uh, I um, we had 1027 used to be called Fresh, and Fresh was a full rock for the male audience. They kept, no matter where you went, it was. I think men like to think of it as a feminine product more than a radio station. We had success with women, but never. We were never a universal radio station, and so we became New 1027. In 2018, we relaunched the radio station, and I had talent on the air that I really liked, but people are going to call bullshit on your change if you run jockless and then show up with all the same jocks on the air 2 weeks later. And I had a great imaging voice. I like Sip. He was a great imager, but you can't use the same guy. You've got to just change it all. We used jingles. We had real world jingles on the air on Fresh. The New 1027 couldn't have any jingles. I mean, we had over the years, because so many artists came up, we had every artist in the world saying Fresh 1027, 102.7. And it was like, okay, we're not going to use any of those. And we even we dropped the point, as a matter of fact, as well. We became 1027. So, if you're going to change, you really have to change if you want to be noticed. One of the things they always say in sales departments is frequency sells. I mean, somebody buys 12 commercials on your radio station over the course of a week. No one's going to hear the spots. They're going to get no reaction to those. If you put a new promotion on the air and you're not running 50 recorded and 150 live mentions a week, you're going to know you've got the promotion on the air. You've really got to let people know what you're doing.
Jim, contemporary and young music formats have been struggling in general in the ratings, yet formats like AC and classic hits are performing really well. I mean, what's the takeaway from these trends, and what would you do if you were you were programming a KISS or a Z100 in this era?
Well, Z100 has the luxury of having Elvis Duran. I mean, he drives that radio station without question. But one of the things that I can tell you, I mean, I had a moment a few years ago. It hit me really pretty hard. There was a great song. I don't recall the title, but the artist was Matt Carney. Great artist, just fabulous. And I'm playing the song, I don't know, 35 times a week, which is a, B rotation in hot AC. And with my core, the song is number 2. But I look at the other 50% of my call out sample, which is Cume, but is core to another radio station, and it's dead last. And I have the epiphany that, okay, I've got this great song. I own this song. I own this song today. My core loves this song. But when a Z100 P1 punches into 1027 and hears the song, they have no idea what the freak the song is. And chances are they're going to tune out and go to something familiar. So it was the wake-up call that I need to play the hits. And I know I aggravate a lot of record people who are doing their job, and they say, hey, we've got this song. And I say, okay, call me back when it's in sub-power at Z100. But really, familiarity is in this day and age of fragmented media, as we talked about, whether it be YouTube or Spotify, or you need either a television show, you need a movie, you need another radio station playing it, you need streaming, you need some sort of other verification in the songs that you play. Z100 in New York is a very, very tight radio station. They pretty much look at the streaming numbers as I can tell by their playlist. I think between going to that kind of music philosophy and Elvis Duran, they've been able to stay as successful as they are. I mean, this in April they were fifth, 6+ in New York. WNEW was right behind them by 0.4 of a point and 6.
Right. So what you're saying, Jim, is a record that's exclusive to 102.7, that's doing exceptionally well with your core, but terrible in your call out with your cume, that you kind of decided to move on from that strategy and dump those records and really looking for some support from Z100 or
anywhere. I can't make them a hit. I can't make them a hit. Yeah. You know, the one song currently that surprises me is the Pink song, Trustfall. I think Pink has had enough exposure on television and the fact that she's got some shows coming to the market and is a longtime core artist of the radio station that I actually do see call out on that song. But that's so rare that an artist can have that kind of success. So for the most part, you know, we're playing those, you know, SZA. Obviously, anything by Taylor Swift right now is we're 8 days away from her first show at MetLife Stadium. My playlist is rather heavy on Tay-Tay at the moment.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. So just before we jump to a few questions, and again, if you're viewing and you have a question, type it in the chat box. We'll get to those in one moment. We did skip over the pre and post COVID. There was obviously a lot of talk during COVID about what to do. But now that we've been out of COVID for a while, what have been the lasting changes and how do you adapt to those in the programming of a radio station?
Well, we do know that when people work from home, they don't listen to the radio. So God knows we're very happy that some of them are working 3 days a week in the office. They're in the car, and we're seeing the listening numbers increase. I think it comes to personalities. I mean, if you're in the car on Monday, on let's say Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday going to work, I think your morning show can really help things by working that horizontal listening. In other words, if you're doing a morning show is doing a story arc where the conclusion of the story arc is on a Friday to get that other day, so when people are at home as opposed to commuting to work, that they tune in on that day where they normally wouldn't be using radio. And you know, another problem that we have is obviously we have financial difficulties. I mean, everyone does, and I don't have to, you know, just point at radio. I mean, Facebook and Google and everyone has cut back on the number of employees simply because there's not as much revenue from advertising right now. So, you know, we don't have the budgets that we used to go out and be visible. So, you know, we have to use social media more and you know, and try and fight for those opportunities. We have to ask our DJs to go out and make an appearance whenever possible. I mean, on CBS-FM, I always joke, Joe Causey does our night show. I always say he'd go to the opening of an envelope. But, you know, Joe has made a point of being known in New York. You stand on a street corner with Joe, and invariably there'll be a police officer or two who would come by and go, "Hey, Joe, how you doing?" because he's been out there and so visible. So, and look, as you look at radio companies, I think the company that we all marvel at is Town Square. I mean, they're reporting incredibly successful quarters. They've moved into digital, and they're in smaller markets, and that's where radio really can flourish so much more in terms of advertising than a big market. I mean, if you own 4 car dealerships in New Jersey, you would advertise on the radio to get word out. You would advertise in a market of 17 million people, even though your 4 car dealerships were only in one very specific area. Well, now that car dealership would use Facebook, Google advertising as opposed to radio. Whereas if you're in Rockford, Illinois, people anywhere in the market will drive to your Chevrolet dealership to see the new electric Silverado pickup. So radio is very important and so viable in that size of a market.
Well put. This is the last question before we take your questions. So please, in the chat box, the Q&A section only, now's your time to ask a question of Jim. Jim, I would not be doing my job if I didn't ask you about imaging. You were telling me a story that was just fantastic prior to us going live about Scott Shannon telling you a lesson about how the greatest imaging started on a typewriter. Can you expound on that?
Well, no, Scott, I learned so much from Scott. I learned so much from Scott before he was a colleague, and so much from him when he was in the building. And one of his bits of wisdom that I cling to and I use all the time and always give him full credit for it is the greatest radio stations in history have been created on a typewriter. Well, you can replace typewriter with keyboard, but it's really true. I mean, if words paint the picture, words explain what you're doing, your contest, your radio station, they create the feeling. That 5 seconds between 2 great songs, that 20 seconds promo, that piece of imaging out of a stop set that hooks people in and gets them to listen to that next set of music, that is so vitally important. And you have to keep it fresh. You have to keep updating it. You have to find new ways to sell that radio station. And I'm not just saying, positioning statement either. I mean, at CBS-FM, New York's greatest hits, but yes, you need to sell more of a feeling. I mean, our secondary positioning for years has been songs that you sing along with. And, people have said to me, well, that's so dorky. I was like, oh, yeah, it's dorky, but think about it for 1 second. If you're singing along with a song, A, you know the words, it's familiar, and B, you like it, because you're not going to sing along with a song that you freaking hate. So it's another way of saying that you're playing great, familiar music that puts you in a good mood. And so think about that with your imaging. I mean, Scott's words are so correct. Create a great radio station with words and the imaging that you put between those songs. And remember, your competition gets the same music that you do. So stand out by putting the greatest imaging between those songs.
Yeah, outstanding advice. Yeah, terrific. So Broadway Bill Lee.
Can I go on your payroll now?
Yeah, go on, Benztown.
You're hired.
Yeah,
you're hired.
So Broadway Bill Lee, who's watching along, your afternoon guy at CBS, of course, in the Radio Hall of Fame in the States. We were talking earlier about how you coach talent, and he wrote, Jim opens the door and says, quote, when he steps off the rails, quote, you don't like being number one, do you? And then you must close the door and walk away. But that's a great line.
What do you have to say to someone like Broadway?
Exactly. No, perfect. I used to
We've
say to
got a
Jock
question
some.
from.
It's motivation. I mean, I'm not there for Race and Broadway and John Fox and Karen and Mike Adam and Emily West to scold them. I'm there to try to motivate them, and hopefully I do that.
Fantastic.
We have a question from Boyd Leader. When you launched Fox and Annie, you mentioned that you played more music. How much attention? You mentioned that you played more music. My apologies. How much attention did you give to playing more music? Was it part of the imaging? Question mark.
No, it really wasn't. We when Scott left on the 16th, obviously we were in holiday mode, and I put the Saturday morning clock in, the 2 stop sets an hour and long stop sets as they were. Oof. And just played a lot of music, but it wasn't, because it wasn't going to be a long-term strategic position that there's more music than other radio stations. Now, we actually did that at BEB back in the mid '90s. There was a lot of talk on the radio in the morning in Philadelphia, and this was long before the DSPs were in use. Our positioning statement was the most music in the morning and all day long, and it was a positioning statement that, because it was really clear with all our competitors talking so much in the morning, that we were playing the most music in the morning, so therefore we must be playing the most music all day long. I don't think you can own a most music position right now with your competitors being what they are, whether so I don't think I mentioned even Sirius or Pandora or Spotify obviously is playing a key role. We're seeing, Ken, you would know these numbers better than me. I'm going to say between 7 and 9% in most markets. Would you say Spotify usage somewhere around there? YouTube,
yes.
Yeah.
If you've got a question for Jim, please enter it now in the Q&A section. I'm sorry, Jim, go ahead.
So I mean, you can't own the most music position. You can do a commercial-free hour. You can do things like that, but you have to look for positions that you can own. And right now, because so much listening is done on smart speakers and in the workplace on laptops, computers, we're on an even playing field. I mean, you're seeing more and more listening through the stream. It's not uncommon to see a music radio station doing 25% of its average quarter hour from the stream these days. And sports, I mean, there are rating books in New York where I've seen the fan stream being top 5 in morning drive, and that clearly smart speaker and probably to a lesser extent app listening. So we're perceived. Spotify is perceived as a competitor, really.
Yeah. So Jim, we're just about out of time, but I wanted to share a quote from an iconic New York record guy that typed it in the chat box, Jerry Lumbo, who I know you know. He says, radio personalities create fan engagement. The great ones encourage interaction and build relationships with their listeners. They evoke emotions and memories, and Jim is doing a great job keeping that alive. But thought that was well said. So,
Jerry, I owe you a bottle of wine or something.
Yeah, you probably owe him a dinner now. Well, listen, thank you. This was really wonderful to have you on, and you shared so much about what we promised about working with Scott, and then of course, some of the lessons, lifelong lessons you've learned as one of the best PDs in radio. So thank you. If you want to contact Jim, you can see his contact info is on the screen. Shoot him an email. If he's not on the golf course in Florida this afternoon, he may get back to you.
I'll be doing a music log. Don't worry, it's all okay. And by the way, I need to give credit where credit is due for the current success at CBS-FM. John Fox has handled everything. He's been handling the talent since the start of the year, and he's been handling all the promotions, and I'm helping him with the music right now. But the ball will be fully in his court very shortly. So
fantastic!
Congratulations on your success, John.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim. I want to thank our producer, Robbie, who makes this all happen. Most of all, thank you guys for watching. If you missed any part of today's webinar, you want to share it, see it again, it will be posted tomorrow and available at benztown.com, the p1mediagroup.com websites, YouTube, or social channels, just about everywhere. And we'll be back next month. We've got a big guest planned for next month. Don't have the official date yet, but we'll stay tuned, and we'll keep you posted on when that will be. On behalf of P1, Benztown, and of course, Chachi, thanks for filling in today. We appreciate you guys being here.
Thank you. By the way, these were a couple photos we were able to dig up of you, Jim. You're a hard person to track down from a social media aspect. So thought you would appreciate
That's a couple of classics there, that's for sure.
Thank you so much, man. Ken, really appreciate it. And I mean this wholeheartedly. I think you may be the greatest programmer to walk the face of the planet. I hold you in the highest regard, and I'm really appreciative of you taking the time today to do this and answer these questions. And I'm sorry to the questions that we did not get to, but if you send them to me or to Jim, I'm sure he'll answer them for you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And we'll leave with one final comment from Race Taylor, the midday jock at CBS-FM in New York. Says, Jim is the best partner. Thank you, Jim. So incredible testament from your staff. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.